Welcome to the mysterious case book. Tonight, the chime of a church bell hides more than a hymn, a secret, a silence, a sudden death. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple listens and begins to see what others overlook. Now pour yourself something warm. Draw the curtains close, and let the mystery begin. It began, as so many things in St. Mary Mead did, with the faintest sound so faint that only those who had grown used to the quiet rhythms of the village could hear its dissonance. The church bell, newly tuned for Easter, gave a peculiar half-beat pause between notes, as though the air itself hesitated before letting the next sound fall. Mrs. Price Ridley noticed it first, on her way to the rehearsal, her gloved hand tightening around her hymn book. A queer thing, she murmured to nobody in particular, for bells to lose their confidence. The phrase travelled, as phrases did, across the cobbled square and into the vestry where the choir gathered that afternoon. The air smelled faintly of polish and lilies. Sunlight poured through the high windows, softening the motes that danced above the pews. Mr. Clement, the vicar, fussed gently over the sheet music, while Mrs. Larch, the organist, tested her notes with thin determination. The scene had all the appearance of tranquil preparation if one did not look too closely at the small discomforts beneath. Miss Marple sat quietly in her customary place near the aisle, knitting in small, decisive movements. She was not part of the choir, but she had a friend's prerogative to attend rehearsals, to lend an ear, as she put it, in case moral support should be needed. Few suspected how much she observed in that gentle attendance, the shifting glances between Mr. Tufnell, the churchwarden, and the vicar's wife, or the way the new soprano from Eastbourne sang with a tremor that had nothing to do with shyness. There was, in fact, a current running through the group that no hymn could quite smooth away. The church's new restoration fund had produced both admiration and jealousy in equal measure. Mr. Tufnell, who managed the accounts, had become the subject of whispers, small ones, of course, framed in the politest tones. So capable with figures, Mrs. Larch had once said, though perhaps a little too confident with other people's purses. It had been meant as a jest. It did not sound like one. The rehearsal began. The voices rose and fell in practiced harmony, yet something perhaps that hesitant bell made every note seem edged with unease. When the tenor section faltered on the refrain, the vicar's mild rebuke carried more tension than necessary. "Gentlemen, please," he said, smiling too broadly. "The Lord appreciates accuracy as much as devotion." A ripple of embarrassed laughter followed, and Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the pause. It was during the third hymn that the real disturbance occurred. Not dramatic, not even noticed by all at once. A clatter, sharp and hollow, echoed from the tower, stairwell. The organ faltered, voices wavered, and the vicar's head snapped up toward the sound. "Probably a pigeon," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, but her tone lacked conviction. The rehearsal resumed, though the rhythm never quite regained its confidence. Only afterward, when the choir dispersed into the pale evening light, did the incident regain its shape. The tower door was found ajar just slightly, enough for the draught to stir the loose music sheets near the organ. Mr. Tufnell, who prided himself on precision, declared it impossible. "I locked it myself," he said, frowning at the heavy key that hung from his chain. Yet the latch, inspected by Mr. Clement, showed no sign of tampering. It was the sort of trivial inconsistency that St. Mary Mead stored away like a seed, waiting for the right soil of conversation to grow into something larger. By the time dusk settled, the village had already divided itself into the usual factions. The practical souls dismissed it as air pressure and old hinges. The imaginative ones recalled tales of the bell tower ghost who, according to the church's older records, appeared whenever the parish's peace was about to fracture. And in between, the curious majority waited for a respectable explanation that would never quite satisfy them. Miss Marple walked home along the lane bordered by budding hawthorn. The air smelled faintly of rain. She moved at her unhurried pace, her knitting now tucked away, her mind quietly at work. A door left open without reason, a bell that hesitated, a tremor in a young woman's voice, each a thread, slight in itself, yet capable of weaving the pattern of something more consequential. At the gate of her cottage, she paused. Across the lane, the church tower rose against the dimming sky, its outline calm and immutable. But as the wind shifted, she fancied she heard the bell again, one faint chime, slightly off-beat, like the echo of an unfinished thought. It was probably her imagination. In St. Mary Mead, imagination was a dangerous and entirely human thing. The next bell struck properly at 8, steady and untroubled, though by then the village had already fashioned its own discord. The incident at the rehearsal, slight as it was, had passed through tea-tables and hedgerows with the delicacy of a secret eager for light. By morning, half of St. Mary Mead could tell you that the tower door had been left open. By noon, they disagreed on who had left it so. Miss Marple, on her way to the post office, encountered Mrs. Price Ridley in a brisk conversation with Miss Hartnell near the greengrocer's window. The words keys and tower drifted audibly into the chill spring air. Miss Hartnell, red-faced and indignant, insisted that any sensible person would have heard an intruder if one existed. Mrs. Price Ridley countered that sound travels queerly up stone stairways, and that, in any case, one could never be too sure about newcomers. The word newcomer held a certain weight. The choir's new soprano was, of course, from Eastbourne, and had only taken rooms at Mrs. Bartlett's lodging-house a fortnight ago. "Such a sweet voice," Miss Marple said mildly as she approached, adjusting her gloves, though perhaps a little strained yesterday evening. "The air in the church can be terribly dry." Mrs. Price Ridley looked sharply at her, as if the observation carried some hidden judgment. "You always notice the smallest things, Miss Marple," she said, with a touch of unease. "Only when they seemed to matter," Miss Marple replied, and went on toward the post office, her steps light, her eyes thoughtful. Inside, the rhythm of the morning post carried its usual civility. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, was buying stamps and discussing church restoration funds in his low, deliberate voice. "A remarkable effort by Mr. Tufnell," he said to the postmistress. "Quite above reproach, I'm sure." The emphasis on sure was the sort that invited contradiction without admitting one. The postmistress nodded politely while counting change, though her glance flickered toward Miss Marple in silent consultation. One did not need to speak openly. The village language was fluent in implication. Outside again, the world looked deceptively peaceful. The cottage gardens were waking from winter. The school children's laughter floated down the lane like a hymn reprised in sunlight. Yet beneath it all, the sense of something unsettled persisted, as though the village were rehearsing its innocence before a performance it did not yet understand. By the afternoon, Mr. Clement called briefly upon Miss Marple, as he often did when a trifling matter troubled him. He was uneasy in his clerical collar, a man of conscience bound by politeness. "Only the smallest oddity, Miss Marple," he began. "Mr. Tufnell assures me the tower door was locked, yet Mrs. Larch insists she saw it open before rehearsal began. There is no harm done, naturally, but well-roomers have a way of acquiring legs." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with her usual grace, "and sometimes those legs run rather faster than reason. You mustn't let it trouble you." "Quite," said the vicar, though his sigh betrayed the effort. "Still, I dislike the feeling that something ordinary might conceal disorder. It's unchristian, I dare say, but unsettling all the same." As he spoke, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the mantel, where a small clock ticked with reassuring precision. "Things that seem ordinary often conceal human nature, Mr. Clement," she said softly. "And human nature, as you know, is not always orderly." Their conversation was interrupted by a light knock. It was Mrs. Larch, the organist, looking flustered. Her thin face was pale under the brim of her hat, and her gloved hands trembled slightly. "Forgive me, Vicar, Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "but the bell ropes, one of them's been cut clean through. I found it this morning when I went to check the hymn sheets. Neatly sliced, as if with a knife." Mr. Clement stood so abruptly that his teacup rattled. Good heavens, surely not vandalism. Mrs. Larch pressed a hand to her chest. "I thought perhaps a child, but no child would climb the tower steps alone." Her eyes darted nervously to Miss Marple. "Do you think it could be symbolic somehow?" The vicar frowned, already burdened by responsibility. "We'll say nothing until we know more," he said firmly. "Let us avoid unnecessary talk." Miss Marple merely nodded. She could almost hear, in the silence that followed, the echo of that hesitant bell from the night before, a warning wrapped in routine. By evening, the rumour had grown legs indeed. Mr. Tufnell was heard assuring anyone who would listen that the ropes had frayed naturally, that the thing was pure coincidence. But in the snug of the Blue Boar, Mr. Bartlett told a different story of a quarrel overheard between Mr. Tufnell and the new soprano about a promised donation. "He's not the sort to forgive a slight," Bartlett declared, polishing his glass. "And she's not the sort to keep secrets, by the sound of it." Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her window as twilight thickened, watching the lamps flicker on across the lane. From her seat she could see the faint outline of the church tower, solemn and still against the fading light. She thought of the severed bell ropen act, tidy, deliberate, perhaps angry, and the young woman from Eastbourne, singing as though to forget herself. Appearances, Miss Marple reflected, were very rarely the whole truth in St. Mary Mead. Respectability, like a hymn sung too loudly, could drown the very note that mattered. A soft rain had begun to fall, turning the cobbles into mirrors of lamplight. Miss Marple remained by the window, the faint rhythm of drops upon the sill mingling with the murmured bells from the church. They did not ring fully that evening, only a cautious single toll, as though the tower itself wished to speak but had thought better of it. The sound was pensive, almost remorseful, and Miss Marple wondered not for the first time whether human conscience made the same small pause before confession. At the vicarage, the atmosphere was less contemplative. Mr. Clement had called in Inspector Craddock from Much Benham, not officially, of course, merely to advise. The inspector, a man of good sense and dry humour, stood now in the vestry, examining the severed bell rope. The fibres were clean-cut, the slice straight as a line drawn by a draftsman. "Not the work of time or decay," he said quietly. "A deliberate hand and a steady one." Mr. Clement shifted uncomfortably. "Then someone intended mischief." Craddock gave a thin smile. "Mischief, perhaps, or a message. Either way, it's personal. These small villages always are." Meanwhile, Mrs. Larch fluttered about like a nervous sparrow, muttering that she would never again trust the stillness of that tower. Mr. Tufnell maintained his composure, but his watch chain trembled faintly as he pocketed his keys. The new soprano, Miss Graham, lingered near the door, her eyes wide and pale. She looked as though she might dissolve if anyone spoke too sharply to her. When Miss Marple entered quietly, as she always did, the young woman seemed almost relieved. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I only said the door was open because I thought it odd." "It's quite right to mention what troubles one," said Miss Marple kindly. "Even oddities have their purpose." Her voice was soft, but her gaze took in everything: the trembling hands, the careful distance between Tufnell and the vicar, the single drop of candle wax hardened on the flagstone where none should be. It was, as she thought privately, a little too tidy a stage. Craddock, who had known Miss Marple long enough to value her silence, approached her afterward. "If you'll forgive the intrusion, ma'am," he said in his courteous way. "You always seem to notice the thread before it's tangled." "Any impressions?" Miss Marple smiled. "Only that some people mistake devotion for control, Inspector, and control, when threatened, can behave very oddly indeed." He looked puzzled, but wrote something in his notebook all the same. By morning, St. Mary Mead had entered its full chorus of speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley declared it a prank born of jealousy within the choir. Colonel Melchett suspected of a young man's mischief. Miss Hartnell, less charitable, insisted it was that girl from Eastbourne, though no one could say what she had to gain. Each explanation seemed plausible, each faintly self-serving. The truth, as usual, hid beneath a veneer of righteousness. Miss Marple spent the afternoon with Mrs. Bantry at the manor, sipping tea beside the fire. The conversation, though ostensibly about parish matters, drifted inevitably toward the church affair. "My dear," said Mrs. Bantry, leaning forward with relish, "I do adore a touch of mystery. A cut rope, a frightened soprano. It sounds almost theatrical." Miss Marple's needles paused in mid-air. "Theatre and truth are often cousins, Dolly. People act their innocence far better than their guilt." "It's a matter of rehearsal." Mrs. Bantry laughed, missing the weight beneath the remark. "Then we're all actors in St. Mary Mead." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, resuming her knitting. "But not all remember their lines quite so well." That evening, as dusk pooled in the lanes, another unease settled over the village. Mr. Tufnell failed to appear at the parish meeting, a small omission, yet immediately noticed. His absence stirred a low hum among the attendees. The vicar tried to proceed with business, but the murmur of curiosity drowned the minutes. When the meeting adjourned, Miss Marple walked home beneath the dripping eaves, her umbrella tapping lightly. The moon hung blurred behind the rain clouds, a silver coin half buried in ash. She had almost reached her gate when she heard hurried steps behind her. Miss Graham's voice followed, breathless and strained. "Please, Miss Marple, you'll think me foolish, but there's something in the tower again. A light, I saw it from my window." Miss Marple turned, calm but alert. "Are you certain it wasn't a reflection?" The girl shook her head. "No, ma'am. It moved, like someone carrying a lamp." There was a pause. The church stood dark and silent against the sky, yet a faint, flickering glow seemed indeed to pulse behind one of the narrow slits of the bell chamber. "I should fetch the vicar," Miss Graham whispered. "No," said Miss Marple gently. "Not yet. Let us see first who fears the dark." Together they approached the churchyard gate, fast gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. The rain had ceased, leaving the air damp and metallic. From within the tower came the faint creak of a stair, and then abruptly the dull thud of something falling. Miss Graham gasped and clutched Miss Marple's arm. For a moment there was no sound at all, only the slow, uneven echo of a bell rope swaying above. The sound seemed to linger longer than it should, heavy and resonant, as if the stone itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple's hand, though steady, pressed lightly against the iron gate. She could feel the vibration beneath her palm, a quiet pulse that spoke of something more than mere accident. Miss Graham stood rigid beside her, her voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. "Stay here, my dear," said Miss Marple softly. She moved forward, the lantern from the porch casting a modest circle of light ahead. Each step up the tower stair felt weighted, the spiral narrow and damp from the night's rain. The faint smell of wax and rope mingled with something sharper, metallic, unpleasantly human. When the turn of the stairs opened at last to the belfry, the light found what she had expected, though she wished it had not. Mr. Tufnell lay at the base of the bell frame, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him, his pocket watch chain tangled around the broken rope end. His spectacles had fallen several feet away, glinting faintly where the lantern's beam touched them. For a moment, all was still save the faint, rhythmic drip of rain-water through a crack in the roof. Miss Marple did not cry out. She only knelt with quiet composure and studied the body's posture, the linear arrangement, and the unnatural symmetry of it. It was the kind of stillness that suggested design, not fall. Below, Miss Graham's cry echoed up the stairwell as she caught sight of the scene. "Oh, dear Lord, he's dead," He must have slipped. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, though her tone carried no conviction. But one rarely slips upward, my dear, and he seems to have been coming down. By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, summoned in haste from the vicarage, the churchyard was beginning to fill with the cautious figures of the curious. Lamps glowed behind frosted windows, and whispers drifted like smoke through the drizzle. Craddock entered briskly, his coat collar raised, and took in the scene with a soldier's economy of motion. "Well," he said after a long pause, "the man's dead, certainly. Fall from height or something staged to look like one." Mr. Clement followed close behind, pale and shaken. "He was a good man, Inspector, diligent if a little exacting. Oh, this will cast a dreadful shadow over the parish." Miss Marple turned her eyes to the ropes swaying gently overhead. "Shadows often tell more truth than daylight, Vicar. They show what stands between light and substance." Craddock crouched beside the body, his expression thoughtful. "No weapon, no struggle, nothing obviously stolen. But look at this." He pointed to the cut end of the second rope, the one severed the day before. "Whoever sliced it may have known how to use the tower's machinery. These things don't cut easily, not without forethought." Mrs. Larch appeared soon after, breathless and weeping openly into her handkerchief. "It's dreadful, Inspector. He was so kind about my playing, even when others weren't. He said the bell fund would make the church sound like heaven again." "Did he, indeed?" Craddock said. "And did he mention where the money for that came from?" Mrs. Larch blinked, uncertain. "Why, from the subscriptions, surely. The ladies' circle raised most of it. I gave what I could." Her tone faltered, though some said the accounts were complicated. In the vestry later, as Craddock took notes, the murmur of unease spread. Miss Graham confessed through trembling lips that she had seen Tough Nell lingering near the tower after rehearsal, arguing softly with someone she couldn't identify. "A man's voice," she said, "deep, cross, but I was too far to hear the words." The vicar looked stricken. There was only myself and the caretaker that night. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, the faintest furrow between her brows. "The tower door was found open, you recall. Sometimes a conversation leaves its door ajar, too." That evening, the village held its collective breath. Curtains drew earlier than usual. Lights went out, though behind them hearts beat faster with speculation. The death of Mr. Tough Nelson proper, so precise, felt like the toppling of a boundary. If respectability could fall, what else might crumble? Miss Marple, alone in her parlour, sat without her knitting for once. On the table before her lay 3 small items: a frayed piece of rope from the tower, a church leaflet folded to show the bell fund ledger, and a pressed violet she had found caught in the stairwell dust. Its presence puzzled her. Not many men wore flowers, and certainly not in a tower. She thought of Miss Graham's trembling voice, of Mrs. Larch's anxious tears, and of Mr. Clement's insistence on order. The pattern was forming, though whether it belonged to truth or illusion, she could not yet tell. Outside, the rain began again, softer now, washing the churchyard stones until they gleamed like wet glass. The bell gave a single, hesitant chime, as though testing its own voice. Miss Marple rose, her silhouette framed by the lamplight. Somewhere, she knew, a conscience was already ringing too, and unlike the bell, it would not stay silent long. The morning after the rain rose clean and bright, yet the village seemed to move through a haze. People spoke more softly, as though volume itself might invite misfortune. The church bells were silent, even the sparrows on the vicarage wall appeared subdued. Only the newspapers rustled anxiously, self-importantly in the postmistress's hands as she read the brief column from the County Gazette: local tragedy in church tower, accident or foul play. Miss Marple, having received her own copy, read the line twice, then folded it neatly beside her breakfast tray. The phrasing, she noted, had been chosen for safety, not truth. Accident or foul play would satisfy both the curious and the cautious. In St. Mary Mead, those were often the same people. By 10:30, Inspector Craddock was again at the vicarage, conferring with Mr. Clement in the small study whose curtains had not yet been drawn back. "You see, sir," he was saying, "we found no sign of forced entry, but the cut rope, the position of the body, none of it speaks of mere missteps. The watch chain wound round his wrist, the missing key from his ring, it's all too tidy by half." The vicar shook his head wearily. Mr. Tufnell was meticulous. He would have noticed a thing misplaced. "It's dreadful to imagine anyone wishing him harm." Craddock's tone was dry. "Most dreadful things are difficult to imagine until they've happened." Outside, the choir assembled for what should have been another rehearsal, but voices faltered before the first note. Mrs. Larch sat at the organ, her back ramrod straight, fingers resting motionless on the keys. Miss Graham stood apart near the vestry window, her face pale as the lilies on the altar. She started slightly when Miss Marple entered, offering her a small, tremulous smile. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "you mustn't think singing sinful. The dead, you know, rarely object to what is done with sincerity." "It's not that," Miss Graham whispered. "It's just he was standing so near me that evening. He asked about my rooms at Mrs. Bartlett's. He seemed urgent. I thought it was only friendliness." Her voice broke. "Do you think he meant to meet someone in the tower?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Perhaps he did. The tower is quite a discreet place for those who prefer their meetings unobserved. Mrs. Price Ridley, bustling up with her hymn book, overheard enough to form a story of her own. Within the hour, half the parish knew or believed that Miss Graham had been involved with the deceased. By tea-time, the story had matured to include a supposed quarrel over money, an argument about the Bell Fund, and an unwise promise of marriage. None of it was true, though each version carried just enough resemblance to reality to sound possible. That was the danger of gossip. It resembled understanding without ever achieving it. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, was conducting his quiet inquiries. He learned from Mrs. Bartlett that Miss Graham had received a letter 2 days earlier in an unfamiliar hand, now conveniently missing. He also learned that Mr. Tufnell's accounts, when checked by the diocesan treasurer, revealed a small but distinct discrepancy of £20 unaccounted for. A clerical error, the vicar insisted, but Craddock's eyebrow rose. "Perhaps clerical," he said, "but not accidental." Miss Marple, watching all this unfold, understood the village's instinct to assign guilt swiftly. "It reassures them," she remarked to Mrs. Bantry later that afternoon, as they walked the lane toward the churchyard. "If one can name the sinner, the world feels safe again, the illusion of order. Dolly, it's very comforting." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "And you don't believe Miss Graham capable of, well, murder?" "Capable is a word with layers," said Miss Marple, eyes soft but shrewd. "We are all capable of something unpleasant under the right moral disguise. But I rather think her fear was genuine." The funeral arrangements were already underway by evening. Mr. Clement insisted upon a public service to ease the conscience of the community. Yet his hands trembled as he prepared his notes, and more than once he looked toward the bell tower with a conflicted expression. Miss Marple noticed the hesitation and stored it quietly. Emotional truth, she knew, was often found in such half-glances. After supper, she wandered into the church alone. The air was cold and carried the faint scent of brass polish and wilted flowers. The severed ropes had been removed, but their absence was eloquent. High above, the great bells loomed in the darkness, mute witnesses to human folly. Miss Marple stood beneath them, thinking of balance and gravity, of what must be released for something else to rise. A sudden sounder click of heel against stone made her turn. Inspector Craddock stood in the archway, lantern in hand. "I thought you'd be here," he said quietly. "You've that look about you, half pity, half suspicion. She smiled faintly. It's only that people's hearts are not so different from bells, Inspector. Pull the wrong rope and something dreadful may ring out. Craddock regarded her for a moment, then lowered his voice. There's something you should know. We found the missing key in Miss Graham's coat pocket. She swears she never saw it before. Miss Marple's eyes widened, not with surprise, but with recognition of a pattern she had hoped would remain broken. Ah, she said softly. Then the rehearsal isn't over yet. The key lay between them on the vestry table, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It was small, brass, and oddly ornate for such a practical object, its bow shaped like a trefoil, the metal worn smooth by habitual use. Inspector Craddock regarded it with quiet irritation at Miss Marple, with faint curiosity. It seemed to belong to no known lock in the church. Yet there it was, drawn from Miss Graham's coat pocket like a conjurer's trick impossible to explain, yet undeniable. She insists she's never seen it, Craddock said, his voice low. And I'm inclined to believe her. The maid who fetched her coat swears it was hanging in the choir room all evening. Still, there's no denying whose pocket it was in. Miss Marple bent slightly, studying the key's teeth. Such an inconvenient thing, to have what one does not understand. People are so quick to call an object evidence when it might merely be mischief. You think it was planted, then? I think, said Miss Marple mildly, that those who hide things often forget the personality of the person they hide them upon. It's very hard to fake another's habits. Craddock exhaled through his nose. There's something off about this whole business. The missing £20, the cut rope, the door that won't stay locked. It's like someone's rehearsing chaos. That, said Miss Marple, is sometimes the only way to control a story. Give the village too many threads to follow, and none will reach the truth. Outside, the evening deepened into a curious hush. The village had the feel of a stage after curtain applause spent, whispers lingering. Inside the Blue Boar, the usual patron spoke in cautious tones. Death had turned every glance into a half-question. Mrs. Price Ridley now claimed she had always suspected Mr. Tufnell's temper. Miss Hartnell asserted that young women from seaside towns carried troubles with them. Even the vicarage cook was said to have cried out that she would never again polish a bell unless supervised by clergy. St. Mary Mead was, in short, alive with righteousness and an excellent camouflage for guilt. Miss Marple walked home along the lane, her umbrella tapping the cobbles in rhythm to her thoughts. The moon had returned, pale and aloof, casting the church tower into relief. It looked serene again, as though nothing dreadful had ever happened there. Yet serenity, she reflected, was often a form of deceit. The world presented calm surfaces so that its cracks might be better concealed. She had almost reached her gate when a voice startled her from the hedge. Miss Marple, might I have a word? It was Mrs. Larch, wrapped in a shawl, her expression pinched by anxiety. I shouldn't be out at this hour, she said nervously. But it's been on my mind since the rehearsal. You see, Mr. Tufnell asked me to keep something for him. Just a small envelope, said it was part of the accounts, not to be opened till after Easter. I'd quite forgotten it until now. Miss Marple accepted the thin packet without comment. It was unsealed, yet bore Tufnell's neat handwriting for safekeeping. Inside lay a single slip of paper with figures scrawled hastily in pencil, and at the bottom, a name L. Graham. Mrs. Larch twisted her hands. I suppose it looks bad for the poor girl. But she didn't seem the sort, did she? No, said Miss Marple softly. But then, neither did Mr. Tufnell. Appearances are courteous liars. Mrs. Larch, they tell us what we wish to believe. The next morning brought more complications. Craddock, pale with fatigue, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage carrying a small evidence bag. Inside was a church ledger, recovered from the vestry cupboard. Hidden behind the hymnals, he explained. The missing £20 accounted for donations collected under the Bell Fund, then withdrawn in cash. signed in Mr. Clement's own hand. Miss Marple poured him tea. "A vicar with a hole in his arithmetic," she said gently. "It happens more often than one expects. He swears he meant to reimburse it, claims he lent it to a parishioner in distress, but he won't say who." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then the distress may be more delicate than financial." Craddock leaned back, frowning. "You think he's protecting someone?" "Or something," she said. "Reputation, perhaps. The most fragile currency in any parish." Later, as the sun set over the churchyard, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the graves. The air smelled faintly of lilac and damp stone. She stopped before the tower, listening to the faint hum of the wind through its hollow archways. It sounded like distant murmuring, an echo of every secret uttered too softly to be caught. In the half-light, a small glint drew her attention near the base of the wall. She stooped and found a broken cufflink, gold but tarnished, bearing the faint engraving of a bird in flight. Not Mr. Tufnell's style. She thought his taste ran to the plain and orderly. This belonged to someone with vanity or perhaps guilt disguised as refinement. She pocketed it carefully, her eyes lifting toward the belfry window where darkness had already gathered. The evening bell rang once more, steady and clear this time. It was as if the village sought to reassert its normal rhythm, to remind itself that even mysterious death could be folded back into routine. Yet Miss Marple, pausing by the lich gate, knew better. In human affairs, order was rarely restored without cost. She felt the weight of the cufflink in her pocket and thought, with quiet certainty, that someone in St. Mary Mead was praying for silence, and that the prayer, soon enough, would fail. The single toll of the bell faded into stillness, leaving the twilight oddly hollow. Miss Marple stood for a moment at the lich gate, the broken cufflink a small weight against her palm. The churchyard around her was steeped in that peculiar calm which comes not from peace, but from waiting. In villages like St. Mary Mead, silence never meant absence. It meant preparation. From across the lane came the crunch of approaching footsteps. Inspector Craddock appeared, hat tilted low against the wind. "You never rest, do you, Miss Marple?" he said mildly, though the lines beneath his eyes betrayed a night without sleep. "One shouldn't when the truth is still awake," she replied. "Has something stirred?" He nodded toward the tower. The caretaker found another oddity. Someone lit a candle up there again in the same place as before. Burnt halfway down. No footprints worth speaking of. "Curious," murmured Miss Marple. "Like a ritual that refuses to end." They walked together toward the vicarage, where a cluster of anxious faces hovered near the windows. Mrs. Larch had taken to carrying her prayer book everywhere, as if moral defense might still be the tongue of suspicion. Miss Graham remained confined to her lodgings under Craddock's request, her landlady reporting much weeping, but little sense. The vicar, meanwhile, had withdrawn from sight entirely. Preparing his sermon, said Mrs. Price Ridley, though with the air of one who privately imagined guilt in every study lamp left burning. Inside the vicarage parlour, the faint smell of candle wax lingered, sweet and suffocating. Craddock spread the newly found ledger and the envelope for Mrs. Larch upon the table. "It's the same hand in both," he said. "Mr. Tufnell's notes, but the sums don't match." He marked one donation twice, as if to cover another. Miss Marple traced a finger along the margin, yet he was a precise man. An error so blatant suggests anxiety, not carelessness. Fear often scrambles neat minds. Craddock frowned. "Fear of discovery, or of confession," said Miss Marple softly. Their talk was interrupted by a knock. Mrs. Bantry swept in, all perfume and agitation. "My dear Miss Marple, have you heard? There's been another accident at Mrs. Bartlett's house." "Accident?" Craddock straightened. "A small fire in the wastebasket started near the soprano's room. Nothing terrible, but the girl fainted dead away. They say she cried out before it started something about seeing a face in the window." Within minutes, they were at the lodging-house, where the scent of scorched paper still hung in the air. The parlour was crowded, Mrs. Bartlett wringing her hands, the maid pale and useless, Miss Graham seated on the sofa under a shawl. Her eyes looked larger than ever, full of confusion. "I was alone," she said weakly. "I heard tapping on the glass 3 times, and then the smoke. I thought it must be him. I mean Mr. Tufnell." Craddock's tone was brisk. "You didn't see anyone?" "No, sir. Only the reflection. It looked taller than him." Miss Marple observed the wastebasket, noting how the edges of the paper had curled inward rather than outward. "Strange," she murmured, "how fire behaves differently when guided than when spontaneous." She lifted one charred scrap with a knitting needle. Faint ink traces showed the curve of a signature. "Mr. Clement's hand again," she said quietly, though not from a ledger this time, perhaps from a letter never meant to be read. The vicar arrived soon after, face pale, collar askew. "I came as soon as I heard," he said. Thank heaven no harm was done. His voice trembled, betraying not just relief but something closer to dread. Miss Marple looked up at him gently. "It must be dreadful, vicar, when one's duties begin to echo one's conscience." He started, as though struck by a sound too familiar. Craddock caught her glance and motioned subtly toward the door. Outside, in the fading light, he muttered, "You think the vicar's involved?" "I think," she said, "he knows more about loyalty than about truth. And those two rarely coexist comfortably." Craddock rubbed his chin. "And the girl, do you still believe her innocence?" "Innocent, perhaps. But innocence can still be wounded. People often harm without realizing until remorse lights the match." As they stood beneath the porch, the church clock began to chime 9. But on the 3rd note, a second bell joined in faint, delayed, and not in harmony. It came from the direction of the tower, though no one had touched its ropes since the death. The sound was uneven, as if someone were tugging them clumsily, desperate to make themselves heard. Craddock broke into a run, Miss Marple following more slowly, her steps steady even through the growing wind. When they reached the churchyard, the doors stood open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the ghostly tremor of the last bell's echo. No one was visible, yet the scent of candle smoke lingered fresh, unmistakable. Near the steps to the tower lay a handkerchief, embroidered with fine initials LG. Miss Marple stooped to lift it, her fingers brushing against a faint smear of wax. The initials caught the lamplight for a moment, glimmering like accusation. "Poor child," she said softly, "always too near the fire." The candle's scent clung faintly to the air, sweet and unsettling, like something too tender for the place it inhabited. Miss Marple stood in the half-lit aisle, the handkerchief still between her fingers. Behind her, Inspector Craddock's boots echoed against the flagstones, each step sharp with irritation. "We were watching this place all evening," he muttered. "No one could have gone in without being seen." Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the tower steps. "Not unless one wished to be unseen," she said quietly. "The most invisible people are those already accounted for." Craddock followed her gaze upward. The tower yawned open above them, its spiral lost in shadow. "You think someone's been hiding up there?" "I think," she replied, "someone's been performing an illusion. One part piety, one part performance, and every performance needs an audience." Before he could answer, a faint sound drifted down from above, the gentle swing of rope against wood, slow and deliberate, like breathing. Craddock drew his torch. The beam cut through dust motes, illuminating the steps. But when they reached the belfry, it was empty, save for a single candle still flickering beside the great bell. Its flame guttered in the draught, fighting extinction. Craddock extinguished it with an impatient hand. "Whoever's doing this has a taste for melodrama." Miss Marple bent to examine the puddle of wax beneath. Embedded in it, just visible, was the impression of a ringsmall oval with a faint crest. Or memory, she said. Not all acts of deceit are born of pride. Some are born of longing. She straightened, her expression unreadable. We must speak to the vicar. They found Mr. Clement in his study, his face buried in his hands. The fire had burned low, casting long shapes across the bookshelves. He looked up as they entered, startled and weary. "Inspector Miss Marple, has there been more mischief?" Miss Marple set the handkerchief and the fragment of wax upon his desk. Both, I fear, connected. "You recognize the initials?" His eyes flickered briefly toward them, then away. "Miss Graham's," he said, his voice controlled. "Poor girl, she's quite undone. Yet she finds the strength to visit the tower," Miss Marple said softly. Clement rose at once. "That's impossible." "She's under watch," Mrs. Bartlett swore. "Mrs. Bartlett," Craddock interrupted dryly, "was found asleep by the fire. I rather think her vigilance lacked stamina." The vicar's shoulders sank. "Then God help us. If she wanders there again, it's my fault entirely." "Is it your fault?" Craddock repeated. Clement hesitated. His eyes, when he met theirs, were full of that particular torment reserved for good men who have told half-truths. "I lent Mr. Tufnell money from the Bell Fund, not for myself, but for her. Miss Graham's father died last year, leaving debts. She was desperate. I thought I could manage it quietly and replace it in time. But Tufnell insisted on keeping account. When I begged him for discretion, he refused. He said reputation was sacred. He meant his own." Miss Marple listened without surprise, her expression almost kind. "And when a man worships reputation," she murmured, "he sometimes mistakes cruelty for virtue." Craddock's jaw tightened. "So there was a quarrel between them?" "Yes," said Clement. "The night of the rehearsal, I confronted him in the tower. He was angry, righteously so. But when I left him, he was alive. I swear it." "Alive," Miss Marple repeated gently. "And alone?" The vicar flinched. "I thought so. For a while there was only the clock ticking, precise and cold." Then Miss Marple said, "You see, Inspector, in small communities goodness can be its own disguise. No one ever looks closely at the pious they shine too brightly to be examined. Yet darkness hides most comfortably beneath a halo." Craddock gave a short, humorless laugh. "You suspect the vicar?" "I suspect that guilt often chooses company. Whether spiritual or criminal, it dislikes being solitary." The following morning brought no rest. A heavy fog rolled through the village, wrapping the cottages in silence. Word spread that Miss Graham had vanished from her lodgings. Her shawl was found near the footpath to the river, her hymn book half buried in the mud. The police began their search at dawn. Villagers stood in doorways whispering that it was divine punishment, or madness, or love gone wrong, each theory cloaked in moral superiority. Miss Marple, however, took her tea as usual, watching the mist curl through her garden. She had already sent a note to Craddock. Look not for the missing, but for what was meant to be seen. By mid-afternoon, a constable arrived breathless at her gate. "Found something, ma'am, down by the vicarage wall." He held out a small object wrapped in cloth, the second half of the broken cufflink, its edge still wet from the fog. Miss Marple took it gently, her eyes narrowing in thought. "Thank you, constable." The pattern completes itself then, and as always, it's the symmetry that betrays the truth. She waited until he was gone, then placed both cufflink halves together upon her table. The engraving formed a full bird in flightless wings spread, its beak open in song. How curious, she thought, that flight and entrapment could share the same symbol. Her gaze drifted to the church tower outside her window, barely visible through the fog. Somewhere behind that veil, the bell would soon toll again, and with it, perhaps, the conscience of a killer. The bell tower's silhouette wavered in the drifting fog, a shape both familiar and unreal. Miss Marple stood at her window, the joined cufflinks gleaming faintly beside her teacup. The village was muffled into secrecy, the sound of boots on wet gravel, the low murmur of searchers calling Miss Graham's name. Yet beneath it all, there was another rhythm, the faint, irregular tolling of a conscience beginning to lose its composure. A knock came, soft but hurried. When she opened the door, Inspector Craddock stood there, his coat slick with mist. "She's been found," he said, voice taut. "Alive. Shaken, but alive." "Where?" "In the churchyard," he replied. "Hiding behind the yews by the north wall, claims she was frightened. Says someone followed her from the vicarage." Miss Marple took her shawl and followed without haste. The fog swallowed the lane as they walked, the air cool and damp, heavy with the scent of moss. By the time they reached the church, a small crowd had gathered near the gate. Mrs. Price Ridley, naturally, had already drawn conclusions that guilt's a terrible thing, she was whispering to Miss Hartnell. Even if one hasn't sinned, the thought of sinning can produce hysteria. The phrase carried both pity and relish, as village morality so often did. Miss Graham sat on the low stone step of the porch, wrapped in a police blanket. Her eyes, reed-rimmed but defiant, turned toward them as they approached. "I didn't run," she said before anyone could accuse her. "I went to pray, that's all. But someone was there in the vestry. I heard breathing. When I called out, it stopped." Craddock crouched beside her. "You're certain it wasn't imagination?" "I know what I heard," she insisted. And then the bell rang. Just once. I thought it was him again, Mr. Tufnell coming back for me. Miss Marple regarded the girl quietly. "Fear often borrows the voice of the past," she said. "But tell me, my dear, why the vestry? Why not the church itself?" Miss Graham hesitated. "Because I left something there. A letter. It wasn't meant for anyone to see." "A confession?" Craddock asked. "No," she whispered. "A goodbye." The inspector looked up at Miss Marple, who gave a slight nod. "Fetch it," she said gently. The truth, however small, deserves a fair hearing. But when Craddock returned moments later, his expression had hardened. The letter was gone. They withdrew into the church, the fog pressing at the windows like unspoken judgment. The air was cold enough to make the candle flames shiver. Miss Marple walked the aisle slowly, her eyes lingering on the pews polished by generations of respectable hands. "You see," she said softly, "truth is rather like a service everyone attends, but few listen." Craddock rubbed the back of his neck. "If that letter's missing, someone's trying to keep the girl silent. But who gains from it? The vicar's reputation is already in question. Mrs. Larch is terrified of scandal, and our gossip brigade is too busy accusing to act." Miss Marple paused at the chancel rail, gazing up toward the bell rope that still swayed faintly from the draught. "Gossip can act, Inspector. It can kill as effectively as rope or fire, but this isn't idle malice. This is orchestration." He frowned. "Meaning?" "That someone's conducting the village like a choir," she said. "Each voice believes it sings alone, when in fact it's part of a larger harmony. And our conductors," he touched the hem of the rope lightly, "knows the value of timing." Outside, the fog thickened to near opacity. The search party had dispersed, leaving the churchyard strangely hollow. Only the faint drip of moisture from the yews disturbed the stillness. Then, from the shadows by the wall, came a rustle, followed by the flicker of a lantern. A figure emerged, moving with deliberate care toward the vestry door. Craddock tensed. "Stay here." He stepped forward, his torch slicing through the mist. The beam caught the intruder's face pale, lined, startled. Mr. Clement froze where he stood, a bundle of papers clutched against his chest. "Vicar," said Craddock, his voice grim, "you've a poor sense of timing." Clement's hands shook. "I came to return them," he said quickly. "Miss Graham's letter among them. I found it near my desk this morning. Someone must have slipped it there." "Someone?" Craddock echoed. "Yes," Clement whispered. "And whoever it was, they mean to ruin us all." Miss Marple moved closer, her gaze resting on the papers. They were damp at the edges, but one corner bore a faint smudge of candle wax, the same shade she'd seen on the handkerchief. She looked at Clement's face, pale with fatigue and shame, and felt a quiet sorrow for him. He was a man built for kindness who had, in his terror, cultivated secrecy instead. "Vicar," she said softly, "you may not yet realize it, but the truth you fear will come whether you welcome it or not. Bells always toll in the end for those who hear and those who refuse, too." He bowed his head, as if already hearing the distant chime. Craddock placed the recovered papers on the vestry table. "We'll sort them properly in the morning," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He looked out toward the fog, which was beginning to lift, faint threads of moonlight breaking through. "There's one thing I don't understand," he muttered. "Why risk so much for a few missing notes and a dead man's reputation?" Miss Marple gave a small, rueful smile. "Because, Inspector, in certain circles, reputation is life, and sometimes the corpse comes second." The fog thinned further, revealing the tower rising cold and clear once more. Somewhere high above, a rope creaked softly in the night air, as though shifting under invisible weight. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it a moment longer than necessary. One small inconsistency was beginning to settle in her mind, like dust taking shape on an unseen surface. The pattern was nearly complete, though she could not yet tell whether it would condemn or absolve. The rope swayed once more, the faint creak carrying through the church like a whisper that had lost its courage. Miss Marple's gaze lingered upon it until the motion ceased. Then, with a small exhale, she turned toward the vestry table where the vicar's papers lay drying beside the guttering lamp. Craddock had stepped outside to give instructions to his men, leaving her alone with Mr. Clement, whose composure had begun to crumble at the edges. "You see, Miss Marple," he said, voice low and uneven, "it wasn't theft. It was mercy, or so I told myself. Miss Graham was desperate, and tough Nell, he saw her distress as opportunity. I thought if I intervened, I might spare her a scandal." He passed a hand over his face, the gesture of a man too weary to defend himself. "Now, of course, it seems my interference merely moved the sin elsewhere." Miss Marple's knitting lay in her lap, untouched but present small symbol of order in a room where morality had unraveled. "Intentions," she said softly, "are often the most dangerous illusions. They allow us to commit wrongs while believing we're preserving virtue." He looked up sharply, as if to protest, but her gentle tone made it impossible. "I did what I thought was right." "Yes," she agreed, "and so, I imagine, did Mr. Tufnell. Right, to his own mind, can be a most elastic concept." Craddock re-entered, shaking the damp from his hat. "We've posted a constable by the tower," he said. "No one's getting near it tonight." The girls resting at Mrs. Bantry's, still frightened, but calmer. His glance shifted to the vicar. "We'll need a full account of your movements tomorrow, sir." "Of course," Clement murmured. "I shall not resist the truth any longer." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "The truth resists no one, Vicar. It simply waits for courage to arrive." They left him there among his books and lamplight, his figure bowed against the encroaching quiet. Outside, the night air felt fresher, though the fog clung stubbornly in patches across the churchyard. Craddock's boots left damp impressions on the stones. "He's not our killer," he said after a moment. "Broken men don't have the energy for that kind of neatness." Miss Marple smiled faintly. But neatness is not always strength. Sometimes it's desperation, an effort to restore symmetry where conscience has made a crack. They walked in silence until the lane divided, one path leading toward the village, the other to Miss Marple's garden gate. From the darkness beyond came a sudden rustle, the faint thud of hurried steps retreating over gravel. Craddock's hand shot out, but by the time his torch flashed, there was only the glint of something metallic dropped in haste. He stooped, retrieving a small ring, the twin of the one that had left its impression in wax. "Whoever they are," he said grimly. They were close enough to listen. Miss Marple regarded the ring in the beam of the torch. Its crest, worn and delicate, bore the same bird in flight as the cufflinks. "It appears," she murmured, "that the choir of guilt continues to sing in perfect harmony." The following morning brought an uneasy stillness to St. Mary Mead. The fog had lifted, revealing the village scrubbed and pale under an anemic sun. At the Blue Boar, the regulars spoke in half voices, uncertain which version of events to believe. Some pitied the vicar, others Miss Graham. A few wondered whether the bell tower might be cursed, though it was clear that the only haunting in St. Mary Mead came from human frailty, not the supernatural. Miss Marple attended the brief service that morning, sitting near the back as the congregation sang without confidence. The absence of the tenor line, Mr. Tufnell's part, created a hollow in the harmony, an absence more eloquent than any sermon. The vicar's voice trembled over the prayers, and Miss Graham, pale but determined, turned the pages with quiet devotion. The candlelight on the altar flickered once, then steadied as though testing its endurance. Afterward, Craddock joined Miss Marple in the churchyard. "The forensics from Much Benham came through," he said, lowering his voice. "The wax on the handkerchief matches the candle from the tower, but so does the wax on the vicar's desk." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A tidy man shares his order with his surroundings. Or perhaps someone borrowed his virtue for camouflage. You mean to say only that neatness, as we agreed, can be mimicry." They paused by the yew trees, where a constable stood watch near the tower door. Miss Marple looked up at the bells, their mouths dark and mute against the daylight. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said. "How sound and silence resemble confession and concealment. The one follows the other, inevitably." Craddock frowned. "I'll admit I don't quite follow." "Oh, you will," she said gently. "But perhaps not before the final note." That evening, while the village drew its curtains against the wind, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the two halves of the cufflink glinting on the table beside her. She had been waiting for a visit, and there came promptly light footsteps on the path, a hesitant knock at the door. Miss Graham entered, her shawl drawn close, her expression somewhere between defiance and exhaustion. "I had to come," she said. "I can't bear it any longer." "They think I killed him." Miss Marple motioned her to sit. "Did you, my dear?" The girl's hands twisted in her lap. "No, but I might have wished for it. Does that make me wicked?" "Only humans," Miss Marple said softly. "Wickedness usually begins with certainty, not doubt." The clock ticked between them, filling the silence. Then Miss Marple reached into her knitting basket and drew out the ring Craddock had found. "You dropped this," she said. Miss Graham stared at it as though it were a relic from a dream. No, that's not mine. I've never seen it." Her denial came too quickly, too sharp. Miss Marple placed the ring on the table beside the cufflinks, the three pieces gleaming together in the lamplight, a complete set, now that they were reunited. "Strange," she murmured, her tone mild but edged with meaning. "Objects, like people, do prefer company." Outside, a gust of wind stirred the eaves, setting the chime on the porch to trembling. Its note was soft and unresolved, like a question waiting for an answer. Miss Marple watched the young woman's face in the wavering light, saw guilt, confusion, and something else beneath it, the faint dawning of relief that comes when lies begin to crack. The lamplight trembled as the wind pressed against the window panes, its glow catching Miss Graham's pale face and the gleam of the reunited jewelry. The faint sound of the chime outside continued, a single note that seemed to hover between reassurance and warning. Miss Marple sat motionless, her knitting untouched, her eyes quietly alert. The girl's shoulders had stiffened, as if she could feel the weight of the older woman's calm scrutiny. "You're very certain you've never seen that ring?" Miss Marple said at last. Her tone was not accusing. It had the softness of someone confirming a detail already understood. "I am," Miss Graham replied quickly. "It must belong to someone else." "Perhaps to—" She hesitated, catching herself, then forced composure. "Perhaps to Mr. Tufnell." Miss Marple's smile deepened in a way that was almost kind. "Ah, but Mr. Tufnell wore no ring. He disliked adornment of any kind, thought it frivolous. I heard him say so only last Easter Sunday when Mrs. Larch admired the bishop's cufflinks. He said men ought to keep their wrists plain as they keep their consciences." The girl's eyes flickered down to the glinting metal. "Then perhaps the vicar." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No. Mr. Clement wears a simple band, the symbol of vows that bind, not of vanity that shines. This piece belongs to someone with a very different sentimentality." Miss Graham's composure cracked for a moment, her breath uneven. "I told you the truth," she whispered. "Oh, I'm quite sure you've told the truth," said Miss Marple, rising slowly. "There are so many kinds. My dear, some meant to protect others, and some meant to protect ourselves. The difficulty lies in knowing which one we've chosen." The clock struck the half-hour, the sound muffled but deliberate. Miss Marple crossed to the window and drew the curtain aside. The village lay hushed, its lights blurred by drizzle. In the faint reflection, she saw Miss Graham's face, white, anxious, half-lit, and something else behind it, the shape of fear wearing the costume of innocence. It was a look Miss Marple had seen before, often in those who meant well but had gone one moral step too far. "You're not safe here tonight," Miss Marple said quietly. "Fear breeds imagination, and imagination can make even an honest person appear guilty. You will sleep in my spare room. Tomorrow you shall tell Inspector Craddock everything, precisely as it happened, no omissions, no embroidery." Miss Graham looked stricken. "I can't. It would ruin him." "Him." Miss Marple turned slightly, knitting now in her tone, though not in her hands. "Which him, I wonder?" There was no answer. The girl's lips parted, but her throat seemed to close around the word. Miss Marple did not press. She merely inclined her head toward the staircase, and the young woman obeyed with the meekness of someone suddenly exhausted by her own resistance. When the door above closed, Miss Marple remained seated long after, listening to the wind and the faint, rhythmic creak of the house settling. It was not, she reflected, the sound of comfort, it was the sound of something holding its breath. Morning came pale and slow, the clouds hanging low over the village green. Inspector Craddock arrived just as the kettle began to whistle, his hat dusted with rain. "You sent for me?" he asked, glancing toward the stairs. "Is she here?" "She is," Miss Marple replied, pouring him tea. "And frightened enough to tell us fragments, though not yet the full piece. I thought it best to let daylight handle what conscience could not in darkness." Craddock sighed. "Fragments are something. At this point, I'll take any bit that fits." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "But you must promise not to mistake tears for innocence. It's the oldest disguise in womanhood and, alas, one of the most effective." They did not have long to wait. Miss Graham descended, pale but composed, her hair neatly pinned. She carried herself like a penitent entering a chapel. "I'll tell you everything," she said, her voice scarcely above a whisper. "But please, you must understand, I never meant for anyone to die." She spoke of the days before the rehearsal, how Mr. Tufnell had been kind to her at first, encouraging her singing, offering to help with her late father's debts. He said he could arrange a donation through the church fund, she said, eyes unfocused. I believed him. Then I found out he expected something in return, something improper. Craddock's expression hardened. And you threatened to expose him? No, I couldn't. I was afraid no one would believe me. I went to the vicar instead. He said he would handle it quietly. But Mr. Tufnell must have discovered he confronted me after rehearsal. He was furious. I ran, and that's the last I saw of him. Miss Marple's needles clicked once she had picked up her knitting again, though her gaze remained fixed on the girl. A terrible situation, she said softly. Men who mistake power for affection, women who mistake secrecy for safety. Yet I notice you omit one small point when, precisely, did you return to the tower? The girl blinked. I didn't. Oh, said Miss Marple mildly, but your handkerchief did. And your initials, you see, are not easily misplaced. Craddock leaned forward. Miss Graham, think carefully. Did anyone else have reason to take that handkerchief? Someone who might wish to draw suspicion toward you? She hesitated too long. Perhaps Mrs. Larch. She dislikes me. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her tone softened. My dear, dislike is rarely so precise. It's gossip's cousin, not murder's. The clock on the mantel struck 9. Craddock rose, his weariness evident. I'll take her statement formally this afternoon, he said. Perhaps the facts will settle when they're written down. When he left, Miss Marple turned to the window once more. The fog had lifted, revealing the bell tower sharp against the morning sky. Its stones gleamed faintly where the rain had washed them clean. Yet even in that clarity, she sensed the same quiet deceit the village wore so expertly, a cleanliness that stopped just short of truth. Behind her, Miss Graham's voice trembled. You think I'm lying? Miss Marple turned. I think, she said gently, that you're telling me everything except the thing that matters, and until you do, my dear, no one in this village will sleep soundly, not even the guilty. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but there was a strange steadiness behind them now, as if some decision had begun to form. She rose abruptly, clutching her shawl. Then perhaps I should go back to the tower, she said. Perhaps that's where it will all make sense. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her voice remained calm. Yes, she murmured. Perhaps it will if you're not alone when you arrive. The wind stirred outside again, setting the garden gate to creaking softly. Miss Marple watched the young woman step out into the pale morning, her figure small against the looming tower beyond the green. A few moments later, she followed, slower, but with purpose. For the first time since the rehearsal began, she felt the story nearing its final note, and like all such music, it would end not with triumph, but with recognition. The air around St. Mary Mead felt oddly expectant, as though the village itself were drawing a breath it dared not release. Miss Marple followed the narrow path past the vicarage hedge, her step unhurried, but purposeful. The morning rain had ended, leaving puddles that mirrored the tower's reflection in distorted fragments, like truth glimpsed through the eyes of too many witnesses. Ahead, Miss Graham's figure moved swiftly, the shawl fluttering like a small, frightened banner. The bell tower loomed darker than the hour warranted, its upper windows blank and unblinking. A constable, stationed near the lich gate, touched his hat respectfully as Miss Marple approached. Inspectors inside, ma'am. Thought it best to keep the young lady in sight till you arrived. Quite right, said Miss Marple. One should never allow grief and guilt to walk alone. They tend to talk each other into rash decisions. Inside, the chill struck at once. Craddock was there, standing near the font, his expression tight with fatigue. Miss Graham sat on a pew, pale but composed, her fingers clasped around a hymn book as though its leather might anchor her. The faint scent of candle wax lingered, and a single taper still burned before the altar, a stubborn flame in a room too accustomed to shadow. She insisted on coming, Craddock murmured. Said she remembered something new. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Memory can be most obliging when the conscience demands company. The girl rose, her voice trembling. It wasn't me in the tower that night, not at first. I went up later after I'd heard the crash. I thought he'd fallen, but when I reached him she stopped, breathing shallowly. He wasn't dead yet. He tried to speak. He said something about the key. Then he stopped. Craddock's pencil paused mid-line. The key to what? I don't know, she whispered, but I remember. I saw his hand move, as if to hide something. I was too afraid to look. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Fear often edits what memory later tries to amend. But tell me, my dear, if you didn't look then, what makes you wish to look now? Miss Graham hesitated, then met her gaze squarely. Because I think someone else did. There was movement near the vestry door, a faint scrape, the sound of fabric brushing stone. Craddock turned sharply, signaling the constable to investigate, but Miss Marple's hand on his arm stopped him. No, she said quietly. Let them listen a moment longer. People reveal themselves most truthfully when they believe they remain unseen. The silence stretched. Then softly, Miss Marple spoke again, not to the girl but to the air. It takes courage, doesn't it, to tidy away another's mistake, especially when that mistake threatens the appearance of righteousness. There was a small gasp from the shadows, followed by the slow, reluctant figure of Mrs. Larch emerging into the light. Her gloves were in one hand, her hat slightly askew, but her composure was that of a woman who had long practiced the art of regret. I didn't mean any of this, she said, quietly. It was only to protect the church. Craddock's voice was sharp. You were in the tower? She nodded. I followed him that night, Mr. Tufnell. He'd hinted about resigning, about taking the accounts elsewhere. I thought he might mean to disgrace us, to bring the police into parish matters. When I reached the top, he was already shouting at her, at Miss Graham. She ran, and he slipped. It was an accident, truly it was. But he was alive. He begged me to fetch help, and then he said, "The key," Miss Marple finished softly. Yes, my dear, he told you the same. Mrs. Larch pressed the gloves to her mouth, tears starting. He wanted the key to the tower safe, the one he'd given the vicar to hold. He said there was proof inside that would ruin everyone. I thought it best to end it quietly, for the good of the parish. So you took it, Craddock said grimly. She nodded, and hid it in the church cupboard. I meant to burn it later, but her voice broke. I didn't expect the rope to give way. I didn't expect him to fall so far. Miss Marple regarded her gently. We rarely do, Mrs. Larch. One small snip made for dignity's sake, one cut of moral convenience, and suddenly the whole weight of consequence drops. The older woman wept silently. Miss Graham stood motionless, her shawl sliding from her shoulders. So it was her, she said, her tone strangely even. She let him die. Miss Marple's gaze turned toward the girl. No, my dear. She believed she was saving your reputation, your future. Selfishness often disguises itself as generosity, especially among the respectable. Craddock retrieved the small iron key from Mrs. Larch's trembling hand. We'll confirm the rest, he said quietly. But I think we have enough. He turned to Miss Marple. You knew, didn't you? The moment we found the second cufflink. She smiled faintly. I suspected. The pattern was too symmetrical. Accidents seldom are. He sighed, pocketing the key. And what of the vicar? Miss Marple looked toward the altar, where the candle flickered low. He will suffer precisely as much as he can bear, and perhaps that will be sufficient punishment. Truth rarely leaves its servants unscathed. The formalities of law followed their predictable course. Statements were taken, the church sealed, the village murmuring anew with its strange blend of pity and fascination. Mrs. Larch's confession became the day's central tale, though, as Miss Marple reflected later, not one villager would remember it quite the same way. Each would polish it to their own moral liking, smoothing its edges until guilt became misunderstanding, and misunderstanding an unfortunate necessity. That evening, Miss Marple returned home through the soft drizzle. The air carried the scent of wet lilac and cooling earth. She lit her fire, set her kettle on, and sat before the warmth in thoughtful silence. On the table lay the ring, the cufflinks, and a small envelope marked Evidence. Their gleam had dulled as, though weary of serving as symbols for vanity, deceit, and misplaced virtue. When Craddock arrived to take his leave, she poured him tea and offered a modest smile. "You see, Inspector," she said, "it's not the great sins that trouble places like St. Mary Mead. It's the small ones, dressed up as duty. They breed in parlours and choir stalls, fed by good intentions and fear of gossip. By the time they're recognized, they've become tragedies." He nodded, eyes heavy with fatigue. "You make it sound inevitable." "Oh no," she said softly. "Only humans." The church bells rang faintly across the fields, then 1, 2, 3, clear and steady. Their tone was different now, neither mournful nor triumphant, but curiously resolved. Miss Marple listened until the sound faded, a faint smile touching her lips. "They've been restrung," she said quietly. "How nice. Perhaps they'll learn to ring true at last." Outside, the mist thinned, and the last echo of the bells lingered in the evening air. One final note of imperfect harmony, fading into peace.